1993. The world was a different place, and many game genres have yet to be dreamed up. And Richard Garfield comes out with this, previously called Mana Clash, released as Magic the Gathering. The game borrowed a lot, from board games and from the fantasy genre, and from this game, an entire genre was born. Using cards as the game pieces, sometimes sole game pieces, with emphasis on strategy and variance is what the game ends up being in practice. But something like that isn't the most appealing to an impressionable audience. But you know what is? The idea of being a powerful wizard, slinging spells and summoning creatures to do battle with other wizards. There's a reason why the backs of video game boxes sound so exciting. Once you get into a game like Magic or Pokemon or Yu-Gi-Oh!, there are a lot more complex strategies and gameplay to keep you invested. But these aren't the things that attract players initially. Tell me, would any of you have bought a booster pack if the cards didn't have the beautiful art or interesting names? If instead of Shivan Dragon or Blue Eyes White Dragon, they were just called card number 5 and card number 17. Although the gameplay will make sure new players stay, you need something else to make sure people take a look in the first place. The cards themselves need to have appeal, and sometimes that's utilizing the setting of high fantasy, sometimes it's utilizing an established intellectual property, and sometimes you just got some cool designs. People need a reason to buy in, and like they say, we eat with our eyes first. Personal anecdote time. I like Starcraft 2, and I suck at it. And from the games I've played, the faction that would likely suit me most is Protoss. But I play exclusively Zerg, because I like their design, their lore, the fantasy the Swarm sells. The character is what hooked me. Now with that established, cards need to not only be well designed in a gameplay perspective, but also from a general aesthetic perspective. It really helps when the card is both appealing to play and appealing to look at. The card should fit the fantasy that the game is trying to fool the players into believing in, and advance the subtle storytelling the game pushes. So the gameplay mechanics do help in this. Swarms of small fast goblins, machines and dragons combining with themselves to make big monsters, and growing your Pokemon from small critters to big threatening monsters. Cards generally try to serve one of two purposes: to enrich the fantasy through world building, helping the immersion of the players, and to create interesting gameplay mechanics that help the players enjoy the game the cards were printed for. But sometimes, cards can fulfill both at the same time. A card that fulfills the fantasy while having its gameplay elements directly tie into that fantasy. A card that has flavor. Flavor is cool, and flavor is really good for the game. It is the result of a card designer not only understanding the game, but also understanding the background or fantasy that the art or character or creature is derived from. If a card is well made, the effect will be intuitive. Of course it works like that. That makes perfect sense. A new player, or even an experienced player, can look at something and go, hey, that's pretty cool. Not only does it fulfill the two things a card should, I also think it enhances them at the same time. And to help demonstrate this, I will go over some of my favorite cards in terms of flavor. Let's start with Magic and move through the games. Basically, all of the Delver cards are massive flavor wins. A researcher turning into a bug monster through the folly of his own research. And this is demonstrated by revealing the top card of your library, and if it is a sorcery or an instant, indicating a successful experiment, the scientist turns into a bug. It's pretty cool. I also really like Goblin Spy. Small and cheap, because it is a goblin, and because it's a spy, it exposes information. And because he's a goblin, not usually a very smart creature, it spies on you instead of your opponent. Funny stuff. Elbrus, the Binding Blade, is a very expensive artifact that does very little on its own. But if you manage to draw blood with it, you get rewarded with this guy, who is an incredibly large demon. You unseal the demon from the Cursed Dagger. Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, is the burial ground of one of Magic's most notable villains. One that is quite synonymous with both the black color identity and the corruption that is the plane of Phyrexia. So it makes sense that even in his resting ground, he would still spread corruption, turning all land into swamps. Force of Savagery is a tornado that tramples, has big attack power, and no toughness at all. This is neat. One more Magic example, then I'll move on. Most of the cards from the Theros block are really flavorful. The sagas are a really cool way to tell a multi-step story through a single card. And Rescue from the Underworld is really cool, paralleling the tale of Orpheus. Really neat. Magic has good flavor, but so does Yu-Gi-Oh! And because Yu-Gi-Oh! Is more heavily based in archetypes, Yu-Gi-Oh! Can dive a bit deeper into individual concepts. and have many groups of cards that help sell a fantasy. And because Yu-Gi-Oh! Isn't directly drawing from a high fantasy setting, at least nowadays the game draws more from popular culture, they can be very creative with their cards. I really like the Purely cards. These guys are just cats, or dogs, whatever. But the entire archetype revolves around this one little guy, this pet-type creature. Purely searches spell cards, all experiences an owner has with their pet, and each of these are how Purely evolves into its stronger forms. Feed the pet turns plump. Wash the pet, and the pet becomes beautiful. And once it gets enough memories, it becomes unstoppable. If you treat your pet right, the only way anyone can stop it is to drop a turtle on it. Really cool. And the deck I find myself currently enamored with, Mimigools. These are mimics, fantasy monsters that try to lure adventurers by mimicking the appearance of a chest of loot. But when their prey comes close, they don't have a good day. Now, these monsters would make perfect sense to be trap cards, but they're not. Instead, they are monster cards with a special mechanic. All the Mimigools have effects when flipped, so before they're flipped, they're like a closed chest. Then you flip them, open the chest to find the monster within. And because your opponent wouldn't just flip your cards with no suspicion, the Mimighoul cards allow you to place them on your opponent's side of the field. You give them a rigged gift, a monster in disguise. And once each of them are flipped, they have effects that all help sell the fantasy of these being dungeon monsters. The dragon burning all the creatures around it, the demon doing funny trickery, the siren charming your monsters, the slime duplicating, and the armor protecting them from battle. I'm a big fan of these guys. Couple of fast ones I'll go through. Sky Strikers being mecha with one pilot switching suits, Goblins being powerful to strike but cowardly and weak, Vanquished Soul being analogous with Tag Fighters, with each of them coming in with assists depending on your team, and the rebirth and destruction cycle of the Ashen cards being very similar to the themes of the Souls games. And that last one lets me easily move on to the second way flavor can be expressed. Not through fulfilling their own storytelling fantasy, but by drawing upon others. This is the strategy that the Pokemon trading card game and Hearthstone have leaned on. Sure, at the end of the day, the card game is different from the video game, and Hearthstone isn't Warcraft. They even took it out of the title. And they both do tell their own stories. But when the IPs are so closely aligned, it just makes sense to bring some of what you already have to enhance something new. Grass types being able to grow fast and evolve, rare candies speeding up evolution just like how they speed up leveling up, a speedy bird may be able to come into play without evolving properly, or Verse Seeker recycling trainers paralleling its use to rebattle trainers. And in Hearthstone, we have characters like Deathwing attacking indiscriminately, Leroy charging in while creating more threats for his team, and the fact that Gorgon Zormu is a real character from Warcraft has just made me feel very conflicted. But even considering these games and how heavily they depend on their parent properties, they still branch out and create their own stories and fantasies. The Pokemon trading card game introduced many characters and mechanics that didn't exist in the video games, such as the whole Delta Species thing. Hearthstone has introduced many new characters, with the League of Explorers having an entire storyline having them face off against the League of Evil. Even when they have story material to base off of, they're still innovating and growing on their own. Hearthstone isn't just Warcraft, and the Pokemon trading card game isn't just Pokemon. Cards like these help them have their own identity. So flavor is good. This is something I keep saying. But I do want to put a caveat on it. Flavor will always be a good thing, but sometimes the way we get to the flavor may not be worth it in the long run. The previous two examples had flavor by comparing the cards with the source material they were based on. How well does the character translate to a card? And that does work. But sometimes, you don't want to use your source material, and you can take advantage of something else to bring in flavor. In today's age of culture, everything collaborates with everything else. Crossovers between properties are very common, and why wouldn't they be? Games like Smash are built on a basis of crossovers, and 2 out of the 4 latest Street Fighter characters have been from other fighting games. Bring multiple properties together and you get the best of both worlds. Property A gets exposure from those who already have a vested interest in Property B, and Property B gets the same thing from fans of Property A. Magic has done this before, and they've been able to execute to great effect. The whole set with Lord of the Rings gave us Tolkien characters in a setting that is fantasy adjacent enough to make perfect sense. And it blessed us with cards like Gimli, Counter of Kills. Counts kills just like in the source material, and no matter how big the creature felled is, it still only counts as 1. And a card like the Nazgul, a card with 9 different arts, wiggling past normal deck building restrictions to fit more with the 9 mortal men who were doomed to die. And much like how the One Ring threw all of Middle-earth into strife, the One Ring card threw the modern metagame into strife. When done correctly, a crossover like this can be good for everyone, but not every crossover is without consequences. In order for a crossover to work without problems, it has to at least somewhat fit the world and fantasy that the property is trying to sell. It makes sense why Street Fighter would add Terry or Cody because they come from very similar games and very similar worlds. Them being plopped into Street Fighter just makes sense. And for a game like Smash, of course Minecraft Steve would make his way in. The game is at its core a celebration of all things gaming, which is why they didn't add Goku or Jiren. But sometimes it deviates too far from the initial world and it starts taking away from it a bit. Negan in Tekken is cool, but it takes a bit away from the integrity of the property and sets a precedent that you may not be happy with in the future. And how much that matters depends on the IP. Yu-Gi-Oh's identity has been looser, so making Dark Souls and Dragon Maid cards isn't very damaging. It is something that can be very successful. I mean, just look at Fortnite. But like I said, harms the integrity of the property. Just look at Fortnite. Not everything has to collaborate with everything else. People come in to buy into the fantasy that you're selling, whether it be science fiction, a world of superheroes, or fantasy. Don't add things that are going to explicitly take them out of it. So even though I really like the Starcraft mini set, I like Starcraft, and many of the cards printed have great flavor, Zerglings doubling, Banelings doing splash damage, and Vipers snatching something from safety, I think it strays a bit too far from Hearthstone and takes away from the world that Hearthstone has created. Again, crossovers like these make too much sense to not do, and are an easy way for card designers to make very interesting and flavorful cards. But please think about how to do it and where you do them. Something like a costume or a secret lair drop is not nearly as intrusive as a whole tournament legal character or a set that releases into the standard format of tournament play. I'm not saying don't do crossovers. Crossovers are great. Just try to put a bit of work in so you don't end up like either of these two. Do what you can to bring in new people. It's a business at the end of the day. But don't forget about your foundations. You have so many ways of making your fans happy, of drawing in new players with ingenious card design. You don't need any of these outside characters owned by anyone else. You don't need to go to other worlds. Make your world interesting and vivid. Tell a story only your characters could tell, and people will come on their own. Magic has come a long way since 1993, and it has grown and grown with many, many new planes. But sometimes, we have to know when to hit the brakes, so that initial beautiful game from decades ago can still remain in sight.